The sun over the New Mexico territory did not shine so much as it hammered the earth, a relentless, white-hot blacksmith striking an anvil that never cooled. Here, in the southern stretch of the territory where the land crumbled away into the chaotic brokenness of the Mexican border. The geography was a testament to violence. It was a landscape of endless pale sand, hooked and thorny mesquite shrubs that clawed at passing trouser legs, and dry arroyos that scarred the earth like old knife wounds. In the distance, great red mesas rose up from the floor of the desert, shimmering and warping in the heat haze until they looked like ships adrift on a burning ocean. In the center of this desolation sat Perdido Wells, a town that had no business existing and yet clung to life with the stubborn desperation of a tick on a lean steer. The buildings were bleached gray by the wind and scoured raw by the sand that never stopped blowing. There was a livery, a mercantile with dusty windows, a church that stood empty more often than not, and the Golden Steer Saloon, which roared even when the rest of the town whimpered. But the heart of Perdido Wells was the windmill. It was a towering skeleton of iron and wood, its blades groaning a rhythmic, metallic song that could be heard for miles. Beneath it lay the only reliable deep well in 2 days of riding, and leaning against the rail of the raised platform that surrounded the pump, usually with a cigar clamped between his teeth, was Elias Briggs. Briggs owned the water, which meant he owned the town. He was a man of heavy appetites and heavier influence, with a chest like a barrel and eyes that missed nothing. He watched the daily struggle for survival with the detached interest of a boy watching ants in a jar. Below him, ranch hands rode out in suffocating dust clouds to check on cattle that grew leaner by the day. Women in faded calico hauled heavy wooden buckets from the public spigot, for which Briggs charged 2 cents a bucket. Mexican laborers and native workers, mostly Apache or Navajo men trying to exist on the fringes of the white man's law, waited at the back of the line, counting copper pennies in calloused palms. The dust was democratic. It gritted between the teeth of the banker and the beggar alike, settling in the corners of eyes and the creases of bed sheets. Lena Hart tasted that dust every time she drew breath, and she hated it with a quiet, simmering intensity. Lena was mid-20s, though the harsh country had stripped away the softness of her youth and left something sharper and more durable in its place. She was originally from Missouri, a place of green hills and rivers that ran cool and deep, but she tried not to think of that anymore. Memories of water only made the thirst worse. Her days were split into 2 heavy halves. In the mornings, she scrubbed floors and changed linens at the boarding house Briggs owned. In the evenings, she stood on the small wooden stage of the Golden Steer Saloon, singing ballads to men who smelled of sweat, horseflesh, and raw whiskey. It was mid-morning now, and the heat was already pressing down with a physical weight. Lena stepped out of the boarding house back door, hauling a basket of damp sheets to the clothesline. Her hair, the color of dark walnut shells, was pinned back severely, but stray tendrils escaped to stick to her damp neck. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty muted by exhaustion and guarded eyes. As she pinned a sheet to the line, Mrs. Gable, the wife of the town storekeeper, walked past on the boardwalk, holding the hand of her young son. Mrs. Gable was a woman who wore her respectability like a suit of armor. When she saw Lena, she didn't just look away. She practically threw her shoulder into a turn, dragging the boy to the other side of the street. "Don't look at her! Billy!" "Mrs." Gable hissed, loud enough to carry across the dusty thoroughfare. Lena did not flinch. She clipped the wooden pin onto the fabric with a steady hand. She was used to it, to the decent women of Perdido Wells. Lena was a stain. She was a widow who had not gone home to her family but had stayed to sing for money. She was a fallen woman, a creature of the night, existing outside the tight circle of church socials and Sunday dinners. The men were no better. They tipped their hats when they passed Mrs. Gable, but when they passed Lena, they slowed their walk, their eyes sliding over her figure with a crude, assessing familiarity. They made jokes that were not quite whispers, betting on how much it would cost to buy more than just a song. Lena finished hanging the laundry and wiped her hands on her apron. The rejection stung. It always did. But she had endured worse things than the judgment of small minds. Suddenly, the wind gusted, snapping the wet sheet like a whip. For a second, the sound threw her back in time. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was 22. The wagon was overturned. Its axle shattered on a hidden rock in the middle of a screaming sandstorm. The sand was not just in the air. It was a solid thing, flaying the skin from their faces. Jacob was lying in the lee of the broken wheel, his lips cracked and bloody, his skin the color of old parchment. The canteen. She reached for the canteen, but her fingers were numb, and it rolled away, tumbling end over end into the howling gray void. Lena, he had rasped, the name sounding like grinding stones. She had woken up 2 days later under a burning sky. Alone. The silence was louder than the storm. She had failed him. She had brought him to this God-forsaken country on a dream of cattle and land, and she had watched the desert drink him dry. Lena gasped, gripping the rough wood of the fence post until splinters dug into her palm. The pain grounded her. She was in Perdido Wells. She was alive. Jacob was gone, and she blamed herself for every mile of desert they had crossed. She pushed the memory down into the dark cellar of her mind where she kept her ghosts, smoothed her apron, and went back inside to work. It was high noon when Caleb Rourke rode into town. He came from the north, riding a dun gelding that looked as road-weary as he felt. Caleb was a man seemingly carved from the landscape itself, lean, sun-cured, and quiet. He wore a trail-dusted coat and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low against the glare. A jagged white scar ran along his jawline, a souvenir from a knife fight in Abilene, or perhaps a skirmish during his time as an army scout. He rarely clarified which. He did not ride with the swagger of a gunslinger looking for a reputation. He rode with the wary economy of a man who knew that wasted motion in this country could kill you. His eyes, the color of flint, scanned the main street. He noted the armed men lounging on Briggs' porch, hired guns, by the look of them, leaning back in chairs but keeping their rifles within arm's reach. He saw the tired faces of the Mexican workers hauling grain sacks. He saw the way the town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for permission to exhale. Caleb needed work. The war and the years of scouting that followed had left him with a set of skills that were useful only in violent places, and he was trying to outrun the blood on his hands. He wanted a quiet job, a herd to push, a paycheck that didn't require killing. He tied his horse at the hitching rail outside the Golden Steer, loosened the cinch to let the animal breathe, and pushed through the bat-wing doors. The saloon was dim and smelled of stale beer and sawdust. It was cooler inside, a reprieve from the anvil outside. Caleb ordered a whiskey and took a table in the back. Sitting with his back to the wall, he nursed the drink, letting the burn settle the dust in his throat. Then, the piano player in the corner struck a few melancholy chords, and Lena Hart stepped onto the low stage. Caleb looked up. She wore a dress of dark blue silk that had seen better days. The hem frayed slightly, but she wore it with a dignity that made the room go quiet. She didn't sing a raucous saloon hall tune. She sang a slow, mourning ballad about a lover lost to the river. Her voice was not the polished soprano of an opera singer. It was rough, textured with smoke and exhaustion, but full of an ache so deep it seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Caleb watched her, transfixed. He had seen beautiful women in St. Louis and San Francisco, painted and powdered, but they had been like dolls. This woman looked like she had walked through fire and come out the other side holding a handful of ash. As she reached the chorus, Lena lifted her gaze and scanned the room. Her eyes met Caleb's. For a heartbeat, the noise of the saloon, the clink of glass, the murmur of card games, fell away. Caleb felt a jolt in his chest, an unsettling recognition. It wasn't that he knew her, but that he recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of someone who was waiting for the next blow to fall. Lena faltered for just a fraction of a second. She saw the scar, the intense gray eyes, the way he sat still as a predator. Men stared at her every night, stripping her with their eyes, But this man looked at her as if he were reading a letter she hadn't meant to send. She looked away quickly, finishing the song and stepping off the stage to scattered, lazy applause. That was quite a performance. A voice boomed. Caleb pulled his gaze from Lena to see a large man approaching his table. It was the man from the windmill platform, Elias Briggs. He wore a suit that cost more than Caleb had made in 10 years, and he smelled of expensive tobacco. "You Rourke?" Briggs asked. Not waiting for an invitation to sit, Caleb nodded. "That is right. Word travels," Briggs said. "Lighting a cigar. Heard you were drifting this way. Heard you ran the trail for the Circle T last season. Kept the herd together through Comanche territory without losing a head. I did the job," Caleb said simply. "I have a job," Briggs said, leaning forward. 3,000 head, north to the railhead in Colorado. It is a long drive, dry country. I need a boss who knows the land and knows how to handle trouble." Caleb swirled the whiskey in his glass. "Standard pay? Double," Briggs said, "plus a bonus upon delivery." Caleb narrowed his eyes. Double pay meant double the danger, or double the dishonesty. Usually both. "Why the bonus?" "Special cargo," Briggs said, his voice dropping an octave. "Hidden in the supply wagons. Just some hardware for a friend up north. Nothing you need to worry about. Long as it gets there." Caleb sensed the trap immediately. Hardware meant guns, and guns moving north usually meant trouble with the law or trouble with the tribes. He wanted to say no. He wanted to ride out of Perdido Wells and never look back, but his pockets were empty, and his horse was lame in the left foreleg. He needed the money to keep moving. "I choose my own men for the point and flank," Caleb said. "Agreed." Briggs smiled, a gesture that showed too many teeth. Just then, Lena walked past their table, carrying a tray of empty glasses. Briggs reached out and caught her wrist. It was a casual, possessive gesture. Lena stiffened, the tray rattling, but she didn't pull away. "Sing something happier next time." "Lena," Briggs said, his thumb rubbing over the inside of her wrist. "You are depressing the customers. And remind Mrs. Higgins you are behind on your room and board again. I will pay her tomorrow. Mr. Briggs," Lena said, her voice tight. Briggs chuckled and looked at Caleb. "Pretty thing, isn't she? A bit used up, but she knows her place. Property comes with the town, so to speak, if you get lonely before the drive starts. Rourke, I can make arrangements. It helps to clear the debt." Caleb felt a muscle in his jaw jump. The casual cruelty, the way Briggs spoke of her as if she were a horse with a bad leg, made a dark, violent heat uncoil in Caleb's gut. He looked at Lena. Her face was burning with shame, her eyes fixed on the floor. He looked back at Briggs. "I am here to push cattle. Briggs, not to buy favors." Briggs laughed, releasing Lena's wrist. She scurried away, disappearing into the back room. "Suit yourself, cowboy, but out here, a man takes what is offered." Caleb said nothing, but the comment lodged deep in his chest like a splinter. He finished his drink, the taste suddenly bitter. That night, the desert turned on them. A sudden pressure drop plunged the town into chaos as a gale-force wind shrieked down from the mesas. It carried a wall of sand that blotted out the stars. The doors of the Golden Steer banged open and shut violently until the bartender barred them. Dust invaded every crack in the walls, coating the bar, the tables, and the drinks in a fine brown powder. Customers shouted to be heard over the roar as kerosene lamps flickered and smoked. Lena had finished her shift and was changing into her street clothes in the small dressing room when the storm hit. She wrapped her shawl tight around her head and stepped out the back door. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Across the street, she saw old Widow Holloway struggling. The wind had snatched the woman's cane, and she was frozen in the middle of the street, blinded by the flying grit. Without thinking, Lena pushed into the gale. The sand stung her face like buckshot. She reached the older woman, gripping her arm to steady her. "Come on!" Lena shouted over the wind. She guided the woman to the safety of the mercantile porch. "Mrs. Holloway looked up, her eyes streaming, ready to thank her savior. When she realized it was Lena, The gratitude froze on her face. She pulled her arm away as if Lena's touch burned. "I can manage," the widow snapped. Turning her back, Lena stood on the porch, the wind tearing at her dress, and felt a desolation deeper than the desert itself. The next morning the air was still thick with suspended dust, turning the sun into a pale, cruel coin in a yellow sky. The wind had died, but the heat remained, magnified by the humidity of the storm. Lena could not breathe. The town, the stairs, the memory of Briggs's hand on her wrist. It was suffocating her. She needed to get out, even just for a few hours. She heard the stagecoach was making a short run to the Miller Ranch, 20 miles out, to deliver supplies. She went to the depot and offered to deliver a small parcel of lace the Miller widow had ordered from the east. The stage driver, a grizzled man named Sam, who chewed tobacco like a cow chewing cud, looked at her skeptically but shrugged. "Suit yourself. Miss, leaving in 10 minutes?" Lena climbed into the coach. It was empty save for her and a quiet man in a bowler hat who looked like a traveling salesman. As the coach lurched forward, leaving Perdido Wells behind, Lena leaned her head against the frame. She watched the town shrink until the windmill was just a toothpick against the sky. For the first time in weeks, her chest loosened. The desert rolled by, monotonous and grand. The silence out here was different. It was clean. They were 15 miles out, crossing a dry wash called Devil's Cut. When it happened, the rains from the storm hadn't reached the ground here, but the wind had shifted the terrain, exposing deep ruts. The right front wheel of the stagecoach hit a patch of wash that looked solid but had been hollowed out from below. There was a sickening crack, loud as a gunshot. The coach lurched violently to the right. Lena was thrown from her seat, slamming into the opposite wall. The salesman screamed. The world spun, sky, ground, sky, ground. The horses panicked, screaming in terror as the weight of the coach dragged them sideways. The vehicle flipped. Wood shattered. Glass exploded. Lena felt a massive impact against her shoulder. Then her head struck something hard, and the world went black. She woke to the sound of wind hissing through scrub brush. Pain radiated from her left shoulder and hip. She groaned, pushing herself up. She was lying in the sand, 10 yards from the wreckage. The coach was a splintered ruin on its side. The horses had broken their traces and bolted. "Sam?" Lena croaked. Her throat was full of sand. There was no answer. She dragged herself toward the wreckage. The salesman was lying near the wheel, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. He was gone. She couldn't see Sam. She crawled further, the sun beating down on her unprotected neck. She found Sam's hat, but the driver was nowhere to be seen, likely thrown further down the wash or dragged by the horses. Lena sat back, clutching her bruised arm. She was alone. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her. She looked at the horizon. It was a wall of heat. She scrambled to find water. She found a canteen in the wreckage, but it had been crushed. The water had leaked out, leaving a dark, rapidly drying stain on the sand. "No," Lena whispered. Flashbacks assaulted her. Jacob's lips, the rolling canteen, the silence. She dragged herself toward a scrubby creosote bush, desperate for the meager shade it offered. The sand burned her palms. Her dress was torn at the hem. Her boots scuffed. "I will not die here." She hissed at the empty sky. She curled into a ball under the bush. The thirst was already clawing at her throat. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slow and shallow. She would not let the desert take her again. She would spite it by living. Miles away, Caleb Rourke was riding the perimeter of the proposed trail road. He had left town before dawn, wanting to check the water holes along the southern pass. He pulled his dun to a halt on a ridge. He squinted against the glare. Something caught his eye in the distance, a break in the pattern of the desert floor, a shape that was too geometric to be natural. He pulled his field glasses from his saddlebag, through the lenses. The shimmering heat stabilized just enough. A tipped coach, a scrap of blue cloth whipping in the wind. "Damn it," Caleb muttered. He spurred the horse. The animal leaped forward, sensing the urgency in its rider. Caleb rode hard. dust stinging his eyes, leaning low over the horse's neck. He covered the distance in 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. As he approached the wreck, he saw the body of the salesman. He saw the shattered wheel. He slowed the horse, his eyes scanning for movement. There, under the brush, a patch of blue silk. He vaulted off the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He ran to her, his boots crunching on the gravel. He knelt beside her. It was the singer, Lena. She was slumped and dazed, her face pale beneath the dirt. Her lips were cracked, and sand was matted in her dark hair. She looked small, broken, like a bird flew into a window. Caleb reached out, his hand hovering for a second before gently touching her shoulder. "Miss Hart?" Lena flinched violently, her eyes flying open. They were wild, unfocused. She stared at him, not seeing him at first. "Water," she rasped. Caleb unhooked his canteen and uncorked it. "Slowly," he commanded. He lifted it to her lips. She grabbed his hand, trying to gulp it down. He pulled it back gently. "Easy. You will make yourself sick. Just a sip." She swallowed, coughing, then took another sip. Awareness slowly returned to her eyes. She looked at the canteen, then up at his face. She saw the scar, the gray eyes. "You," she whispered. "The cowboy. Caleb Rourke," he said softly. "Are you broken anywhere?" "My shoulder," she said. "My hip. I think I am just bruised." Caleb checked her arms and legs with professional, impersonal hands. No broken bones that he could feel. She was lucky. Incredibly lucky. "The others?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Gone," Caleb said grimly. Lena closed her eyes, a tear cutting a track through the dust on her cheek. "The desert," she murmured. "It is always hungry." Caleb capped the canteen. "We need to move. The sun is only getting higher." He stood and offered her his hand. She looked at it, a large, calloused hand, scarred and stained with trail dust. She took it. He pulled her up, but her leg buckled. Caleb caught her, his arm going around her waist to support her. She was pressed against his chest. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the solid thud of his heart through his coat. It was a shock to her system, human warmth in a place that offered only cold indifference. She looked up at him. "I told myself," she started, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "I told myself, if the desert wants me, it is going to have to try harder." Caleb looked down at her. A flicker of admiration crossed his face. He tightened his grip on her waist slightly. "It tried," he said. "It failed. Come on." He led her to his horse. He lifted her easily, as if she weighed nothing, placing her in the saddle. He swung up behind her. The saddle was not meant for two. Lena had to sit forward, pulled back against him. His arms came around her to hold the reins. Her back was pressed against his chest, her legs brushing his. Each movement of the horse sent a flare of pain through her bruised hip, but she bit her lip and made no sound. She found herself clinging to his forearm, her fingers digging into his coat. The fear of the crash was receding, replaced by a racing heart that had nothing to do with the accident. It was the intense, overwhelming awareness of him. His scent, leather, sage, and tobacco, filled her nose. Caleb spurred the horse into a walk. He tried to hold himself rigid, trying to keep a respectful distance, but the motion of the horse made it impossible. She was soft against him, fragile. He felt the tension in her body, the way she shivered despite the heat. They rode for an hour in silence. The sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. Caleb scanned the horizon. Perdido Wells was too far. His horse was carrying double weight in deep sand, and the animal was flagging. They wouldn't make it back before true dark, and navigating the arroyos at night without a moon was suicide. He pulled on the reins, steering the horse toward a rocky outcrop rising from the desert floor about a mile to the east. "We are stopping?" Lena asked, anxiety sharpening her voice. "Horse needs rest," Caleb said, his voice rumbling against her back. "We won't make the town tonight. I know a place up ahead, a shallow cave. It will keep the wind off us." Lena looked at the darkening desert. The idea of spending the night out here terrified her. But then she felt the steady arm of the man behind her, an anchor in the shifting world. "All right," she whispered. Caleb guided the horse toward the rocks. He was deciding to camp there with Lena to keep her alive through the night. But as the first star appeared, he knew the desert wasn't the only danger they were facing. The proximity was a spark, and they were both dry tinder. The horse huffed, climbing the rocky slope, carrying them towards shelter and the long, cold night ahead. The temperature in the high desert did not fall so much as it collapsed. One moment, the rocks were radiating the stored fury of the sun, and the next, a blue-black chill swept down from the mesas, biting through cotton shirts and dusting the skin with goose flesh. Caleb steered the tired dun horse toward the overhang of the rock shelf. It was a geological scar, a place where the earth had buckled and created a shallow, three-sided room open to the stars. He pulled on the reins, bringing the animal to a halt. "Easy now," he murmured. Not to the horse, but to the woman pressed against his back. He swung his leg over the saddle horn and dropped to the ground, his boots crunching on the gravel. He reached up, his hands spanning Lena's waist. She was trembling, a constant, fine vibration that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with shock. "Lean into me," Caleb said. "I have got you." Lena slid from the saddle, her legs giving way the moment her boots touched the earth. Caleb caught her weight against his chest, holding her upright. For a moment, they stood suspended in the growing dark, her forehead resting against the rough wool of his coat, his chin brushing the top of her dust-matted hair. He could smell the sage and the sweat, the metallic tang of fear that clung to her. His hands remained on her waist for a heartbeat longer than necessary, steadying her, before he stepped back, creating a careful distance. "Sit here, against the stone," he instructed, guiding her to the back of the alcove where the heat of the day still lingered in the rock face. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had made his home in the wild. He stripped the saddle from the horse, laying the blanket and his bedroll out on the hard ground for her. He gathered dried mesquite branches and the skeletal remains of a dead cholla cactus, arranging them in a small pyramid. Within minutes, a fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows against the canyon walls. The wind began to moan outside their shelter, a hollow, lonely sound that made the fire seem like the only living thing in the world. Caleb uncorked his canteen and knelt beside Lena. The firelight revealed the extent of the damage. Her face was a map of her ordeal, a dark bruise blooming along her jawline, lips cracked and peeling, eyes sunk deep into dark hollows. Her palms, resting on her knees, were raw and scraped from where she had dragged herself through the sand. "Here," Caleb said softly. "Slow." He held the canteen to her lips. She lunged for it, instinct overriding reason, her hands clutching at his wrists. "Easy," he scolded gently, pulling the vessel back. "You will sick it up if you flood your belly. Sip it, like whiskey." She obeyed, forcing herself to take a small, measured swallow. The water was warm and tasted of tin, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever known. She looked at him over the rim of the canteen, watching the way the firelight played across the sharp angles of his face and the jagged white scar on his jaw. Caleb capped the canteen and set it aside. He reached out, taking her wrist. His fingers were rough, the skin calloused from rope and rain, but his touch was surprisingly light. He pressed 2 fingers against the pulse point of her throat. "Heart is racing," he noted, his voice a low rumble. "It is the cold." Lena lied. She was acutely aware of his hand on her skin. It was an intimacy she had not prepared for. In the saloon, men grabbed. They pawed and pulled, their hands heavy with entitlement. But this clinical, careful touch felt more dangerous. It made her want to lean forward, to rest her cheek against his hand, to borrow his strength. She hated the impulse. She hated the hunger that woke up inside her, a starving thing she thought she had starved to death years ago. Caleb pulled his hand away as if he had been burned. He turned his attention to the fire, poking at the coals with a stick. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. The air in the shallow cave felt too thin, consumed by the fire and their proximity. He needed to fill the silence. He needed to build a wall of words to keep himself from reaching out to her again. "I grew up in a house full of noise," Caleb said suddenly. His eyes were fixed on the flames. "East Texas, 5 brothers. You had to shout to be heard or throw a punch to be respected." Lena pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, watching him. "You have family there still? Buried mostly?" Caleb said. He tossed a twig into the fire and watched it curl and blacken. "My brother Samuel and I. We rode out when the war started. Thought we were going to be heroes. Samuel was 18. He had a laugh you could hear 3 counties over." He paused, his jaw tightening. "We were scouting near the Pecos, 3 years back. Comanche raid. It happened fast. I was on the ridge. He was in the valley. I watched it happen through the scope of my rifle. I put down 3 of them. But it was not enough." "I am sorry," Lena whispered. Caleb shrugged. A stiff, painful motion. "The killing came easy after that. Too easy. You learn where to aim, how to breathe. You stop seeing men and start seeing targets. I looked at my hands one day and realized they were stained. No amount of sand scrubs that off. Hands like mine, they are not meant for holding anything gentle. They are meant for breaking things." He looked at her then, his gaze intense and self-loathing. Lena shifted, wincing as her bruised ribs protested. She looked at her own hands, small and battered against the dark wool of the blanket. "I convinced Jacob to go west," she said, her voice thin. "He wanted to stay in Missouri, open a feed store. I told him we could be rich. I told him the sun was gold out here." She let out a dry, bitter laugh. "He was a good man, gentle, the kind of man who stopped to move a turtle off the road. When the wagon broke, he gave me the last of the water. He didn't even tell me. He just pretended to drink and passed it back. I watched him fade. Caleb, I watched him turn into a husk, and I just sat there and begged the sky to rain. It didn't listen." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I have felt dry inside ever since, like I am filled with dust. I sing in that saloon, and men look at me, and they see a body. They see a mouth, a waist, a skirt to lift. They want a drink from me, but they never ask if I am thirsty. I am just a well to them, a dry well." The confession hung in the air, raw and trembling. The distance between them, physically only a few feet, felt insurmountable and yet non-existent. Without thinking, Lena reached out. Her hand found his in the space between them. Caleb stiffened. He looked at her hand covering his, her skin pale against his weather-beaten knuckles. He could feel the heat of her palm, the desperate human need for connection. He squeezed her hand back, an instinctive, crushing grip. For a second, he leaned toward her. The firelight caught the gold in her eyes, the vulnerability that terrified him more than any Apache arrow. Then he pulled away. He yanked his hand back and stood up, pacing to the edge of the firelight. "Don't," he rasped. "Caleb, if I start," he said, his back to her, looking out at the black void of the desert, "I do not know if I can stop. I am not the man you want to save you. Lena, I am just the man who happened to be riding by." Lena's breath caught. The rejection stung, sharp and familiar. But beneath it was something else, a thrill. He wasn't rejecting her because she was broken. He was rejecting her because he was afraid of how much he wanted her. "Get some sleep," Caleb said, his voice rough. "We ride at first light." He sat near the entrance of the cave, his rifle across his lap, and kept watch over the darkness. Lena lay down, pulling the bedroll up to her chin, and watched the silhouette of his shoulders until exhaustion finally dragged her under. Dawn arrived not with a shout, but with a whisper. The desert turned a soft, bruising purple, then a pale, translucent pink, and finally, a brilliant, hard gold as the sun crested the mesas. They broke camp in silence. The intimacy of the night before hung around them like smoke, uncomfortable in the light of day. They avoided each other's eyes as Caleb kicked dirt over the fire. He led the horse to the rock shelf. "Up you go," he said. He placed his hands on her waist to lift her. She winced, sucking in a breath through her teeth. He paused, his grip tightening for a fraction of a second. supporting her weight entirely until she found her footing in the stirrup. "I have got you," he said again, the words a quiet echo of the night before. They rode back toward Perdido Wells. The world felt bigger now. The mesas seemed taller, the sky wider. The town, when it finally appeared on the horizon as a smudge of gray wood and turning iron, felt small, petty. As they rode down the main street, the town of Perdido Wells stopped. A silence rippled outward from their passing. The blacksmith lowered his hammer. The clerk sweeping the boardwalk leaned on his broom. They stared at the spectacle. The fallen woman, disheveled and dusty, her dress torn, riding behind the scarred drifter, her arms wrapped around his waist. Whispers fluttered like dry leaves. "Look at her," a woman hissed from the doorway of the mercantile. "Shameless. Been out all night," another voice murmured. "You know what that means." Caleb felt the judgment burning his back. He kept his eyes forward, his face a mask of stone, but his hand drifted down to rest on the butt of his revolver. He could feel Lena shrinking against his back, trying to make herself invisible. They reached the livery stable. Caleb swung down and helped Lena dismount. She stood unsteadily, brushing the dust from her skirts, trying to pin up her tangled hair. "Well now," a voice cut through the air. Elias Briggs stepped out of the shadows of the livery barn. He was immaculate in a dark suit, his boots polished to a shine that mocked the dust on everyone else. He looked at Lena, then at Caleb, his eyes narrowing. "We feared the worst." "Lena," Briggs said, moving closer. "When the stage didn't arrive, we thought the Apaches had taken you, or the heat. The stage crashed," Caleb said, stepping between Briggs and Lena. "Wheel broke at Devil's Cut. Driver and the passenger are dead." "Tragedy," Briggs said, though his voice lacked any weight of sorrow. "A terrible tragedy. But you seem to have found a guardian angel, my dear." He reached out, his hand cupping Lena's elbow. His fingers squeezed, digging into the tender flesh. It was a claim, a mark of ownership. "You look a wreck," Briggs said, his voice dropping. "Go get cleaned up. You have work tonight." Lena flinched but didn't pull away. She was too tired, too battered to fight him. Caleb stepped closer. It was a subtle movement, just a shift of weight, but it brought him within striking distance. His shoulder brushed Briggs's arm, forcing the other man to take a half step back or stand his ground and escalate. "She needs a doctor." "Briggs, not a shift," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. Briggs looked at Caleb, surprised by the insolence. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. He released Lena's arm. "She is tough. Rourke. She has to be. Living here. But you are right. Rest up. Lena, we will talk about your debts later." Briggs tipped his hat, his eyes lingering on Lena's torn bodice for a second too long, before turning and walking away. The boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and lye soap. Lena sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the wall. She had washed the sand from her face, but the grit felt permanent, embedded in her soul. There was a heavy knock on the doorframe. It wasn't a request. It was a notification. Briggs stood there, filling the doorway. "I brought the ledger." "Lena," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Please, Mr. Briggs," Lena said, standing up. "I am tired." "The doctor saw you," Briggs said, ignoring her. "He says you are fine. Bruised, but fine. That visit cost $2. Add that to the room, the food, the clothes. You are digging a deep hole." "Darling, I will work extra shifts," Lena said, her voice trembling. Briggs laughed softly. He walked a circle around her, inspecting her like prize livestock. "Singing does not pay that well. There are other ways to work off a debt, faster ways. You know I have always had a soft spot for you. Lena, even when you were playing the grieving widow." He stopped behind her, leaning in close. His breath smelled of whiskey and peppermint. "Stop fighting it. You belong to this town. You belong to me." Lena stiffened, old panic rising in her throat like bile. She stood rigid, terrified that if she moved, he would strike, or worse, he would touch her again. "I will have the money," She whispered. "We will see," Briggs said. He turned and walked out, leaving the door open. In the hallway, hidden by the shadows of the stairwell, Caleb stood frozen. He had come to check on her, to make sure she was all right. He had heard every word. His hands curled into fists at his sides, the knuckles turning white. His jaw was clamped so tight his teeth ached. He wanted to march into that room and beat Briggs until the man couldn't stand. He wanted to burn the ledger and the boarding house and the whole damn town. But he stopped. He knew men like Briggs. They held all the cards. If Caleb acted now, Briggs would have him arrested or shot, and Lena would be left alone, deeper in debt, with no one to watch her back. Violence was a tool, but it had to be used precisely. Caleb turned and walked back down the stairs, his boots silent on the wood, a cold fury settling in his gut. That evening, the sun painted the sky in streaks of violent orange and bruised purple. The air was cooling, but the heat radiating from the ground kept the world warm. Caleb finished his work at the corral, hanging the bridles in the tack room. He wiped the sweat from his neck with a rag and walked around the back of the saloon. He found her there. Lena was taking down sheets from the clothesline, the white fabric glowing in the twilight. She moved slowly, favoring her left side. Caleb cleared his throat. Lena jumped, dropping a clothespin. When she saw it was him, her shoulders relaxed. "You are lurking, cowboy," she said, trying for a smile but failing. "Just walking," he said. He moved closer, picking up the clothespin from the dirt and handing it to her. "I wanted to say—" Caleb started, looking at his boots, then at the horizon, then finally at her. "I'm sorry about this morning. The way they looked at you, it wasn't right. You deserve better than their mouths." Lena let out a short, sharp breath. "I am used to it. Caleb, they need someone to look down on. It makes them feel taller." She reached for the next sheet, and as she did, she hissed in pain. "Let me see," Caleb said. He didn't wait for permission. He took her hand, turning it palm up. The blisters from the ride and the crawl through the sand were raw and weeping. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a strip of clean white cotton he had torn from a shirt earlier. "This will sting," he warned. He wrapped the cloth around her hand, his movements gentle and precise. He tied the knot with his teeth and fingers, efficient and careful. "You are not made to be worn down like this, Lena," he said softly. His head bent over her hand. "You are not leather. You are silk. They are using you to scrub the floor." Lena looked at the top of his head, at the dust in his dark hair. Her chest ached with a sudden, overwhelming pressure. It was the kindness. It was sharper than the cruelty. "The desert is kinder than this town," she whispered. "At least the desert kills you quick. It doesn't bleed you dry for years." Caleb looked up. Their faces were inches apart. The twilight had deepened, blurring the edges of the world, leaving only the two of them in sharp focus. He still held her hand. His thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, a slow, lingering caress that sent a shiver racing up her arm. "Lena," he breathed. She didn't pull away. She leaned in, just an inch. Her eyes searched his, asking a question she didn't have words for. The air between them hummed. They hovered on the precipice, the edge of a kiss that could change everything. Caleb swallowed hard. He began to lean forward. Slam! The back door of the saloon burst open. A wave of raucous laughter and tinny piano music spilled out into the quiet yard. Two men stumbled out, arguing loudly about a poker hand. The spell shattered. Caleb dropped her hand and stepped back, turning toward the fence. Lena grabbed the laundry basket, pulling it against her chest like a shield. "Good night, Caleb," she whispered, and fled toward the back door of the boarding house. Caleb stood alone by the fence, listening to the laughter, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The next morning, the tension in Perdido Wells was palpable. The heat had returned with a vengeance. Briggs found Caleb at the livery stable, checking the hooves of the trail horses. Rourke, Briggs barked. Caleb didn't look up immediately. He finished picking a stone from the hoof of a sorrel mare, dropped the leg, and wiped his hands. "Mr. Briggs, I saw you talking to the girl last night," Briggs said, his eyes hard. "I thought I gave you a friendly warning. I was just helping her with a bandage," Caleb said evenly. "Do not waste your time." Briggs sneered. "A woman like Lena Hart, she is good for one thing. And once you have had that, you will realize she is just like the rest of the dust in this town, cheap and plentiful." Caleb stared at Briggs. The urge to strike the man was a physical itch in his knuckles. "She is a human being, Briggs, not a heifer to be traded." Briggs laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "You have got a soft heart. Rourke, that will get you killed out here. Now, forget the girl. We have business." Briggs motioned for Caleb to follow him into the tack room. He closed the door, cutting off the light. "The drive starts in 2 days," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "But the cattle are just the cover. I figured," Caleb said. "I have got 3 wagons loaded with Winchester repeaters. New model. They are going to a buyer south of the border, a general who is trying to carve out his own piece of Mexico. That is illegal," Caleb said. "And it is treason if the army finds out. The army is busy chasing Apaches." Briggs said, "And the border, well, the border is just a line on a map. The pay is $500. Rourke, each," Caleb did the math. $500 was enough to buy a small ranch, enough to disappear. "The route?" Caleb asked. "Through the Devil's Spine." Briggs said, "No patrols there, just rock and snakes. You get the herd to the rendezvous. You hand over the wagons, and you come back rich. Just make sure no one asks questions, especially not your men." Caleb nodded slowly. "I will handle the men." "Good. And Rourke, if you cross me, well, the desert is a big place, easy to get lost." That night, the air was suffocating. Lena was cleaning the hallway outside Briggs's office in the boarding house. She moved quietly, a habit learned from years of trying to be invisible. The door to the office was ajar. She heard Briggs's voice, thick with brandy, and the lower rumble of his foreman, a man named Royce, who had eyes like a coyote. "He is a sharp one." "That Rourke," Briggs was saying, "he asks too many questions." Royce grunted. "I don't like him." "You don't have to like him. Royce, you just have to use him. Let him lead the herd through the spine. He knows the water holes. Once the exchange is made with the Mexicans, well, we won't need a trail boss anymore." Lena froze, her rag hovering over the dusty wainscoting. "We leave him there?" Royce asked. "Better," Briggs chuckled. "If the army gets sniffy about the guns, we pin it on him. Who is he? A drifter? A man with a violent past? We say he stole the shipment. We say he ran off with the cattle. The law will hunt him down, and we will be sitting here counting the gold." Lena pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The cold knot of fear in her gut twisted violently. They were going to kill him, or worse, frame him, and let the law hang him. The man who had pulled her from the sand, the man who had wrapped her hand in white cotton. She crept away from the door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would crack her ribs. She had to warn him. She couldn't let the desert, or Elias Briggs, take him too. Not this time. The dawn light over the corrals was not gentle. It was a bruised purple that promised another day of suffocating heat. The air was already thick with the smell of horse manure, dry hay, and the acrid dust raised by 3,000 hooves. Lena Hart moved through the swirling grit with a singular purpose. She kept her head down, her shawl pulled tight, dodging the ranch hands who were shouting and coiling ropes. She found Caleb near the supply wagons, tightening the cinch on his dun horse. He looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowing at the distress etched into her face. "Caleb," she said, her voice a breathless whisper. He stopped what he was doing, stepping in close to shield her from the view of the other men. "What is it? You should not be here. Lena, Briggs is watching." "I do not care if the devil himself is watching," she hissed, grabbing the sleeve of his coat. "I heard them. Caleb, last night, Briggs and his foreman, Royce, they were laughing about it. Caleb went still. Laughing about what? About you? About the guns? Lena looked around quickly to ensure they were alone, then spilled the words out in a rush. The cattle are just a cover for the rifles. I know you guessed that part, but they are not planning to pay you. Caleb, they are planning to bury you, Briggs said once the exchange is made south of the border. They do not need a trail boss anymore. They are going to frame you. They will say you stole the shipment and the herd. They want to make you the outlaw so they can play the victims. Caleb stared at her, his face unreadable, but his eyes went cold. He slowly let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he rode into town. I should have known, he said, his voice low and bitter. It fits. A drifter with a scarred face and no kin. Who would question it? He turned back to his horse, his movements jerky with suppressed anger. He yanked the cinch strap tighter, making the horse grunt. It is always the same, he muttered. You try to walk a straight line, and they dig a ditch in front of you. I am done being the scapegoat for men in silk suits. Caleb. Listen to me, Lena pleaded, stepping into his line of sight. You cannot go. You have to leave. Ride out now, before the herd moves. Go north. Go anywhere but with them. And go where? Caleb asked, looking down at her. If I run now, I look guilty. Briggs will send the law after me before I clear the county line. I will be hunted again. Lena, I spent 5 years looking over my shoulder. I am not going back to that life. Then what? You ride into a trap? I handle it, Caleb said, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. I take the job. I watch my back, and when Royce makes his move, I will be ready. It is suicide, Lena said, her voice cracking. There are 12 of them, and one of you? She gripped his lapels, desperation making her bold. Please, Caleb, I cannot watch another man ride out into that desert and not come back. Caleb looked at her hands on his chest, then at her face. The fear in her eyes was not just for him. It was an old fear, a ghost she carried. He reached up and gently covered her hands with his. I am not your husband. Lena, I know how to bleed and keep standing. It is not just that, she blurted out, the words tearing their way out of her throat. You do not know what Briggs is. You do not know what he did to me. Caleb frowned, sensing the shift in her. What he did? Lena looked down, trembling. When I first came here, after Jacob died, I was out of my mind with grief. I was starving. Briggs took me in at the boarding house. He played the kindly benefactor. He gave me food, a room. I thought he was a good man. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Caleb's gaze. A week later, he came to my room. He said payment was due. He didn't want money. I was weak, Caleb. I could barely stand, but I fought him. I scratched his face. I screamed until the other boarders came out. Caleb's hands tightened on hers, his expression darkening into a terrifying stillness. He stopped. Lena whispered, but he made me pay for it. The next day, he told everyone in town I had tried to seduce him. He told the men in the saloon I was loose, that I was easy. He ruined my name so that no respectable door would ever open for me again. He made sure the only place I could work was the saloon, and the only bed I could sleep in was his boarding house, adding to a debt I can never pay. She took a shuddering breath. He broke me. Caleb, he didn't have to use his fists. He used this town. Caleb released her hands and stepped back. His face was pale beneath the tan, his lips drawn back in a snarl. His hand dropped to his gun belt, fingers curling around the walnut grip of his Colt. I am going to kill him, he said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion. A simple statement of fact. He turned toward the main street, toward the office where Briggs sat like a spider in his web. No, Lena cried out. She threw herself in front of him, planting her hands against his chest. Caleb, no, you cannot. Move. Lena, he will have you shot before you reach the steps, Lena begged, pushing against him with all her strength. His men are everywhere. You kill him, and they will hang you from the windmill within the hour. And nothing changes. The town will still believe his lies. They will just say a madman killed a pillar of the community. Caleb stopped, his chest heaving against her hands. The rage in him was a physical heat, radiating off him in waves. He looked at the town, then at Lena. He saw the terror in her eyes, not of Briggs, but for him. "He is a monster," Caleb grated out. "Yes," Lena said, tears finally spilling over. "He is. But if you die today, he wins. Please, Caleb, use your head, not your gun. You said you wanted to find proof. You said you wanted justice, not just blood." Caleb stared at her for a long moment. The red haze in his vision slowly began to recede, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of the soldier he used to be. He took a deep breath, the air whistling through his nose. He lifted his hands from his gun belt and placed them on her shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding. "All right," he said roughly. "All right. I will not kill him today." He looked past her, toward the endless horizon of the desert. "I will take the job. I will ride with the herd. But I am not just delivering cattle. I am going to find where he keeps the records. I am going to find the proof that links those guns to him. And when I come back, I am going to bring the whole world down on his head." "You promise?" Lena whispered. "I cannot promise I will come back." "Lena," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a tender rumble, "the trail is hard, but I promise I will not go down easy, and I promise I will not let him win." Lena looked at him, seeing the scars on his face and the resolve in his eyes. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, and the only safe harbor she had ever known. "Trust me," he said. She nodded, unable to speak. Then, abandoning all propriety, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his coat. She held him tightly, desperate to imprint the feel of him against her memory. Caleb hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then his arms came around her. He held her hard, his chin resting on the top of her head. For a moment, amidst the dust and the noise of the cattle, they were the only two people on earth. Then he pulled away. He had to. If he stayed a moment longer, he would never leave. He swung into the saddle, the leather creaking. He looked down at her one last time, touched the brim of his hat, and turned the horse toward the herd. "Move them out!" he roared, his voice carrying over the bawling of the cattle. Lena stood by the corral fence, her hands gripping the rough wood. She watched as the massive herd began to move, a living river of brown and white. The dust rose in a choking cloud, turning the sun into a hazy orange disk. She watched the figure of the trail boss at the front of the line until he was nothing more than a speck in the distance, swallowed by the land. The trail was a crucible. For 10 days, the herd moved north and west, cutting through a landscape that seemed determined to kill them. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the men and the animals until the air shimmered and danced. Caleb rode point, his eyes scanning the horizon for water, for Apaches, for trouble. He slept in 4-hour shifts. He ate dust and dried beef. He felt the eyes of Royce and the other men on his back, heavy with secrets. The desert showed no mercy. The afternoons were blistering ovens that cooked the moisture right out of a man's skin. The nights were frigid, the temperature plummeting as soon as the sun vanished, forcing the men to huddle in thin wool blankets, shivering against the hard ground. On the 5th day, they reached Sweetwater Springs, a watering hole Caleb had relied on for years. It was bone dry. The mud at the bottom was cracked and baked into a mosaic of tiles. The cattle smelled the lack of water and began to low, a mournful, panicked sound. "We push on to the Bravo tank," Caleb ordered, his voice rasping. "It is another 20 miles. 20 miles in this heat will kill the weak ones," Royce argued, sitting casually on his horse. "Then they die," Caleb said flatly. "But if we stop, they all die. Get them moving. They lost 3 steers that afternoon. One collapsed near a patch of prickly pear, its ribs heaving, tongue lolling out in the dust. It tried to rise, its legs thrashing weakly, but it didn't have the strength." Caleb rode back to it. He looked at the animals suffering. He drew his revolver. He didn't look away as he pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, a sharp punctuation mark to the day's misery. That night, while the men slept and the cattle settled into an uneasy rest, Caleb moved silently through the camp. The supply wagons were parked in a tight circle. The driver, a man loyal to Briggs, was snoring under the axle. Caleb slipped inside the canvas covering of the lead wagon. It was stacked high with sacks of grain and coffee, but underneath the sacks, bolted to the floorboards, were long, heavy wooden crates. Caleb pulled out his knife and carefully pried the lid of one crate open. The moonlight filtered through the canvas, gleaming on the blue-black steel of new Winchester repeating rifles. They were packed in grease and straw, dozens of them. Caleb stared at the weapons. A cold dread settled in his stomach, heavier than the beef he'd eaten for dinner. He knew what these were. He had seen what a dozen men with repeaters could do to a village armed only with bows and old muskets. He remembered the smoke, the screams of women, the bodies of children scattered like broken dolls. These weren't just guns. They were death warrants for people who had no idea they were coming. He lowered the lid and pressed it back into place. He couldn't just deliver them. He couldn't walk away with his $500 and let the blood soak into the ground south of the border. He slipped back out into the night, his mind racing. He needed a plan, but he was running out of time. Back in Perdido Wells, the atmosphere was poisonous. Without Caleb's presence, the town seemed to shrink back into its old, cruel habits. Lena felt the change immediately. The protective bubble he had briefly created around her had popped. Briggs was not idle. He cornered her 2 days after the herd left. Lena was carrying a bucket of water down the back hallway of the boarding house. Briggs stepped out of his office, blocking her path. "You have been quiet." "Lena," he said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "I am doing my work." "Mr. Briggs," she said, trying to step around him. He moved with surprising speed, grabbing her arm and slamming her back against the wall. The water bucket fell, splashing over her boots and the floor. He pressed his body against hers, pinning her there. His hand came up, his fingers digging into her jaw, forcing her to look at him. "I know you talked to him," Briggs hissed. "I saw you at the corrals. What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Lena gasped, her heart hammering. "I told him goodbye. Don't lie to me, you little whore," Briggs snarled. His thumb pressed into the soft hollow of her throat. "Did you tell him about the business? Did you put ideas in his head? He is just a cowboy," Lena choked out. "He just wants his pay." "He'd better," Briggs said, leaning in until his nose brushed hers. "Because if he tries anything, if he thinks he can outsmart me, he will end up as buzzard meat. And you will wish you had died in that coach wreck." Panic flared in Lena, hot and white. She brought her hands up and shoved him hard. "Get off me," she screamed. The force of her push caught him off guard. He stumbled back a step. Lena didn't wait. She turned and ran, her wet boots slipping on the floorboards, bolting out the back door and into the alley. Briggs straightened his jacket, watching her go. He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Run all you want. Lena," he called out. "The desert ends eventually." That night, the sky over the southern edge of town turned a terrifying orange. Fire! It started in the shanty town where the Mexican families and the few Apache workers lived. The structures were made of scrap wood and canvas, dry as tinder. The flames leaped into the night, fed by the desert wind. Lena was in the saloon when the shout went up. She ran outside. The poor quarter was an inferno. Sparks were flying like angry hornets, while the men of the town stood on the boardwalks, watching the spectacle with indifferent eyes. Lena ran toward the flames. She joined a line of women passing buckets from the horse trough. The smoke was thick and acrid, burning her eyes and filling her lungs. "Help!" someone screamed. Lena saw a young Mexican woman trying to drag a heavy trunk out of a burning shack. A child was crying inside. Lena dropped her bucket and dove into the smoke. She grabbed the child, a little boy with wide, terrified eyes, and pulled him out just as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. She handed the boy to his mother, coughing violently, her face streaked with soot. By morning, 6 shacks were ash. The families sat in the dirt, surrounded by the few meager possessions they had saved. Elias Briggs stood on the porch of the Golden Steer, addressing the crowd that had gathered. "It is a shame," Briggs boomed, his voice full of false gravity. "But what can you expect? These people, they are careless, cooking fires left unattended, drunken brawls knocking over lamps. That is a lie." The crowd turned. Lena stood there, smelling of smoke, her dress scorched. "It wasn't carelessness," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "I saw where it started. It started behind the Garcia shack." There was no cooking fire there. It smelled of kerosene. A murmur went through the crowd. Briggs's eyes narrowed. "Miss Hart is overwrought," he said smoothly. "The smoke has confused her. We all know how emotional she gets. Maybe it is time they moved on," a voice shouted from the back. "One of Briggs's hired guns. They are a danger to the town. Driving out the Mexicans and the savages would make us all safer." "Yeah," another voice agreed. Lena looked around at the faces of the townsfolk. She saw fear, yes, but she also saw a hardening prejudice, a willingness to blame the helpless rather than face the truth. "You are monsters," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "They lost everything, and you want to kick them while they are down? You had best watch your tongue." "Lena," a churchwoman snapped, "you have already taken their side. Maybe you should go with them." Lena stood alone in the street, isolated by her courage. She realized then that the fire wasn't just an accident or an act of cruelty. It was a distraction. It was a way to tighten the screws, to make everyone afraid, to make sure Briggs remained the only power that mattered. The trail led them into the Devil's Spine. It was a jagged, twisting canyon of red rock, where the walls rose 500 feet on either side, blocking out the sun for most of the day. The path was narrow, the footing treacherous. Caleb felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was the perfect place for an ambush. He reined in his horse, signaling for the herd to slow. Royce rode up beside him. "Why are we stopping? Something feels wrong," Caleb said, his eyes scanning the rim of the canyon. "You are jumping at shadows." "Rourke," Royce said, a sneer curling his lip. Suddenly, Royce whistled sharp and loud. From behind the boulders ahead, 4 riders emerged. They weren't strangers. They were men from the drag position of their own drive. They had circled around. Caleb went for his gun, but he was too slow. Royce already had his revolver drawn and leveled at Caleb's chest. "Easy." "Rourke," Royce said, "unless you want a hole in your shirt?" Caleb froze, his hand hovering over his Colt. He looked around. He was surrounded. "Get down," Royce commanded. Caleb slowly dismounted, keeping his hands visible. He stepped away from his horse. "What is this, Royce?" Caleb asked, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. "Change of plans," Royce said, swinging down from his saddle. "The boss says your contract is terminated." With a nod from Royce, the men moved in. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. One man swung a rifle butt, catching Caleb in the kidneys. He buckled, gasping. Another kicked his legs out from under him. Caleb hit the sand hard. He tried to scramble up, driving his fist into the jaw of the nearest man, feeling bone crack, but there were too many of them. A boot slammed into his ribs, then another into his face. Light exploded behind his eyes. He tasted copper and dust. "Hold him up," Royce ordered. 2 men grabbed Caleb's arms, hauling him up. He hung there, half conscious, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "You are a thief, Rourke," Royce said, smiling. "You tried to steal the guns. You tried to steal the herd, but we stopped you. You, lying." "Snake," Caleb spat, blood spraying onto Royce's shirt. Royce wiped it off calmly. Then he drew back his fist and drove it into Caleb's stomach. Caleb retched, his knees giving way. "Drop him," Royce said. "They let him fall." Caleb lay face down in the dirt, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. "Take his horse, take his gun, leave him for the coyotes." He heard the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs. He heard Royce laugh. "Let's move. We have a delivery to make." The sound of hooves faded. The dust settled. Silence returned to the canyon. Caleb woke to the sound of buzzing. Flies were crawling on his face. Drawn to the blood, he tried to swat them away, but his arm felt like it was made of lead. He groaned and rolled onto his back. The sky was a fading orange blade slicing across the jagged horizon. Dusk. Pain was a living thing. His ribs screamed with every breath. His head throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. He dragged himself to a sitting position. The world spun. He vomited bile into the sand. He looked around. He was alone. No horse, no water, no gun. He checked his pockets. They had taken his knife. He was 20 miles from the nearest water, in the middle of the devil's spine, wounded and unarmed. They didn't just beat me, he thought, his mind sluggish. They killed me. They just didn't finish the job. He dragged himself toward the shade of a small boulder. He leaned his head back against the rock. They would return to town. They would tell the story. Caleb Rourke, the thief, the traitor, Lena. The thought of her hit him harder than the rifle butt. She would hear the lie. She would think he had taken the money and run. She would think he had abandoned her, just like everyone else. "No," he rasped, his voice a broken croak. He forced his eyes open. He looked at the darkening sky. "I am not dead yet." Briggs. The news hit Perdido Wells 2 days later. Royce rode in alone, looking exhausted and dusty. Playing the part of the hero perfectly, he went straight to the saloon, ordered a whiskey, and told the room the tale. Rourke turned on us. Royce said, his voice carrying to the corners of the room. "We caught him trying to turn the herd south, toward the border. He had a deal with some banditos. We had to fight him off. He ran like a coward when we drew iron. Took a horse and scattered some of the cattle." A murmur of outrage went through the saloon. I knew it. A man said, "Never trust a drifter." Briggs came down from his office, feigning shock. "My cattle?" Briggs asked. "My investment? We saved most of it. Mr. Briggs," Royce said. "But Rourke got away with the best horses and maybe 50 head. Briggs shook his head, looking like a disappointed father. "I misjudged him. I thought he was a man of honor. It just goes to show. You cannot help some people. They are born bad." Lena was wiping down a table near the back. She heard every word. The tray in her hands clattered to the floor. Everyone turned to look at her. "He didn't do it," she whispered. "Lena," Briggs said sadly, "I know you had a fondness for him, but facts are facts. He ran. He left you. He didn't run," she shouted, her voice shrill. "You set him up. You sent him out there to die." She looked around the room, begging someone to believe her. "Don't you see? It is a lie. He wouldn't steal. He wouldn't run." The townsfolk looked at her with pity and disdain. To them, she was just the hysterical saloon singer, defending her lover. "He is gone. Lena, Mrs." Gable said from the doorway. "He made a fool of you. Accept it." Lena backed away, shaking her head. "No, no." She turned and ran out of the saloon, ignoring Briggs' calls. She ran to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to the scrub brush. She stood there, staring out into the vast, empty darkness of the desert. Her heart felt like it had been ripped open. Part of her, the part that had been hurt so many times, wanted to believe it. It was easier to believe he was a thief than to believe he was dead. If he was a thief, he was alive somewhere. But she remembered his eyes at the corral. She remembered his hands on her shoulders. "Trust me, he didn't leave me," she whispered to the wind. She sank to her knees in the dust, clutching her skirt. "He is hurt. He is out there. And he is hurt." She looked at the faint glow of the stars over the mesas. "I will not let you take him," she hissed at the desert. "You took Jacob. You took my life. You are not taking him." She sat there as the moon rose, a small, defiant figure against the night, refusing to accept the ending they had written for her. She would wait, and if he didn't come, she would go find him. The silence of Perdido Wells was heavier than the heat. It was a suffocating blanket that settled over the town the moment the sun climbed past the windmill. To Lena Hart, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed in the boarding house, the silence sounded like an accusation. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears, a rhythmic thumping that matched the beat of the distant windmill pump. Every time she closed her eyes, She saw Caleb's face as he had looked at the corrals, grim, determined, asking her to trust him. And then she heard the voices in the saloon, the easy lies spilling from Royce's mouth, the way the town had nodded and accepted that the drifter was a thief. They were wrong. She knew it in her marrow. Caleb Rourke had not run. He was out there, somewhere in the jagged expanse of the Devil's Spine. And he was alone. Lena stood up, the motion sudden and sharp. She smoothed the front of her faded blue dress. She could not stay here. If she stayed, she would suffocate. If she stayed, she would be accepting Briggs's version of the world, a world where money bought truth and the vulnerable were ground into dust. She packed a small canvas sack with the barest essentials, a tin of dried beef, a box of matches, a small knife she used for paring apples, and the last of her water. She counted the coins in her pocket, $4.30. It was everything she had saved for months. She waited until the siesta hour, when the sun was a white hammer beating the streets empty. She slipped out the back door of the boarding house, moving through the shadows of the alleyways toward the livery stable. The stable boy was asleep on a pile of hay, his hat pulled over his eyes. Lena moved quietly to the back paddock. There was a bay gelding there, a horse with a white star on its forehead and a tired gait. It wasn't fast, but it was sturdy. She worked quickly, her hands trembling as she saddled the animal. She wasn't a thief. The guilt gnawed at her, but the fear for Caleb gnawed harder. She took an old envelope from her pocket and wrote a note in pencil. Borrowed. Will return or pay full value. L.H. She wrapped the $4 and the coins inside the paper and wedged it under a loose board near the tack room door where the owner would find it. She led the horse out the back gate, walking it until they were well past the last shanty. Then she mounted. The saddle was hot against her legs. She turned the horse's nose toward the jagged line of the horizon, toward the place where the sky turned the color of a bruise. Go, she whispered. The desert did not welcome her. Within an hour, the town was gone, swallowed by the heat haze. The world became a wavering mirage of brown and gray. The sun was a physical weight on the back of her neck, a heavy hand pressing her down. Her dress, damp with sweat, clung to her skin like a second, suffocating layer. Lena was not a tracker. She could not read the story of the earth like Caleb could, but the trail left by 3,000 head of cattle was a highway of churned earth and dung that even a child could follow. She rode along the edge of the devastation, keeping her eyes fixed on the distance. The thirst came first. It started as a dryness in the back of her throat and quickly grew into a clawing need. She took small sips from her canteen, rationing it, but the heat sucked the moisture from her body faster than she could replace it. As the miles dragged on, the silence of the desert began to peel away the layers of her mind. The present moment blurred with the past. The squeak of the wagon wheel, that was what she heard. Not the horse's hooves, but the rhythmic squeak of the wagon that had carried her and Jacob West 5 years ago. She blinked, and for a second, the bay horse's neck looked like the mule Jacob had driven. She saw Jacob sitting beside her, his face coated in dust, his eyes bright with a feverish hope. Almost there. Lena, he said, his voice scratching like dry leaves. Just over that ridge. The land is green on the other side. Lena shook her head violently, trying to dislodge the memory. No, she said aloud. Her voice was a croak in the vast emptiness, but the desert didn't care about her denial. The wind picked up, tossing sand into the air, and suddenly she was back in the storm. The sky turned a terrifying, bruising purple. The sand wasn't just in the air, it was the air. Jacob was coughing, a wet, hacking sound that tore at her heart. The wagon lurched. He fell. She was holding his hand, screaming his name over the howl of the wind. But he was staring past her, staring at something she couldn't see. His grip went slack. That was the moment the world ended, not with a bang, but with the sudden, terrible weightlessness of a hand letting go. Lena gasped, jerking the reins. The bay horse danced sideways, startled. She was back in the present. The sun was dipping lower, turning the shadows of the mesquite bushes into long, grasping fingers. Her head pounded with a dull, rhythmic throb. She looked at the canteen. It was nearly empty. "You haven't learned." The wind seemed to whisper. "You think you can cheat the sand twice? I'm not cheating," Lena muttered, her lips cracking. "I'm fighting." She forced the horse on. The tracks of the herd were diverging now, scattering as if the cattle had been spooked. She saw the signs of a struggle in the dirt. Deep furrows, a discarded hat that had been trampled into the earth. He was here, she thought, panic spiking in her chest. But the light was failing. Her vision was blurring at the edges, tunneling down to a pinprick. She felt dizzy, swaying in the saddle. She couldn't go on. Not in the dark, not like this. She spotted a leaning rock formation 100 yards off the trail, a slab of sandstone that offered a sliver of shade. She steered the horse toward it. Dismounting was a controlled fall. Her legs buckled when they hit the ground. She caught herself on the stirrup, breathing hard. She tethered the horse to a shrub and sank down in the shadow of the rock. She lifted the canteen. It felt terrifyingly light. She took a sip, just enough to wet her tongue. "Caleb," she whispered. "Please be out here." She closed her eyes, and the darkness behind her lids was filled with the ghosts of the men she had lost. 2 miles to the west, in the dry wash of a nameless arroyo, a man was dying. Caleb Rourke moved with the agonizing slowness of a cripple. He was using a piece of deadwood as a cane, leaning his weight on it with every step. His left eye was swollen shut, a purple and black ruin. His ribs grated together every time he took a breath, sending white-hot lances of pain through his chest. He had been walking for 2 days, or maybe it was 3. Time had lost its meaning. There was only the sun, the pain, and the thirst. He had sucked on pebbles to keep the saliva flowing. He had dug for water in a damp patch of sand and found only mud. He was burning up, fever raging through his blood, turning the desert into a hallucination. He looked up. Shadows were circling overhead, vultures, patient bastards. Caleb rasped. "Not yet." He stumbled, the stick slipping in the loose gravel. He went down to one knee. It took everything he had to stand up again. He crested the lip of the arroyo and looked out across the flat expanse. He saw a horse, a bay horse, standing head down near a rock, and beside it, a heap of blue fabric. Caleb blinked. He rubbed his good eye with a dirty knuckle. It had to be a mirage. His mind was finally snapping, conjuring up the thing he wanted most. But the horse swished its tail. A mirage didn't swish its tail. "Lena," he croaked. The name tore his throat. He forced his legs to move. He stumbled faster, ignoring the screaming of his ribs. He fell again, scrambled on hands and knees, then got up. "Lena!" he shouted, the sound raw and desperate. The figure in the blue dress stirred. She pushed herself up on one arm, looking around wildly. She saw him, a scarecrow of a man, covered in dried blood and dust, limping toward her out of the twilight. She stared at him as if he were a ghost risen from the grave. "Caleb," she whispered. She tried to stand, but her legs failed her. She fell back against the rock. Caleb reached her. He dropped the stick and collapsed to his knees beside her. He reached out, his shaking hands cupping her face, his thumbs brushing away the grime on her cheeks. "You are real," he said, his voice breaking. "You are real." "I knew it," Lena sobbed, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "I knew you didn't leave. I told them you wouldn't run." Caleb looked at her, at the fierce determination burning in her tired eyes. He started to laugh. It was a dry, hacking sound that turned into a cough, but it was laughter. "You crazy woman," he choked out. "You came out here? Alone? I came to get you," she said, clutching his wrists. They sat there in the dirt, laughing and crying, shaking with the sheer disbelief of being alive, of finding each other in the vastness of the killing ground. "We cannot stay here," Caleb said. Once the hysteria had passed, he struggled to his feet, wincing. He looked at the bay horse. "Good animal," he murmured, patting its neck. He helped Lena stand. She was weak, but the sight of him had given her a new reserve of strength. "I know this country," Caleb said, pointing toward a ridge of dark stone to the south. There is a canyon, narrow. There is a seep there. Water. Bad water, but water. They walked together, leaning on each other. Lena held the horse's reins, and Caleb held Lena. They were a tripod of broken parts, supporting one another against the gravity of the earth. The canyon was a slash in the rock, hidden until you were right on top of it. Inside, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. At the back, beneath a cracked boulder the size of a house, there was a dark, wet stain on the stone. A small pool of water, no bigger than a wash basin, had gathered there. Water. Lena breathed. "Do not drink yet," Caleb warned. "Let it settle." He used his hat to scoop out the dead insects and scum from the surface. Then he cupped his hands. "Drink," he said. The water was bitter, tasting of alkali and salt, but to Lena, it was nectar. She drank, then splashed it on her face, washing away the salt of her tears. Caleb drank next. Long, slow gulps that made his throat work. They sat back against the cool rock, the horse drinking noisily from the pool beside them. The sun was gone now. The canyon was filled with the soft, blue light of early evening. Lena turned to look at him. Now that the immediate crisis of survival was paused, she saw the violence that had been done to him. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the dark bruising on his ribs, the cut above his eye where the blood had dried black. "Briggs' men?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger. "Royce," Caleb said, "and 4 others. They were waiting in the spine." "Cowards," Lena hissed. Caleb looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the protective fury that mirrored his own. He reached up and gently took her hand, pulling it away from his ribs. He pressed her palm against his cheek, leaning into her touch. "I thought I was dead." "Lena," he said softly, "when I was lying there in the sand, I thought that was the end, and the only thing that made me mad, the only thing that made me want to get up, was you." Lena's breath hitched. "Me? I kept seeing you," he said, "standing in that saloon, singing that sad song. You looked like your heart was going to shatter right there on the stage. And I thought, I cannot leave her alone. I cannot let that bastard break her." Lena looked into his good eye. She saw the raw honesty there. She saw a man who had walked through hell not for money, not for pride, but because he couldn't bear the thought of her being alone. The air in the canyon thickened. It became heavy, charged with the electricity of relief and a hunger that had been denied for too long. Lena leaned forward. Her forehead touched his. Their breaths mingled, warm and moist in the cool air. "I am not broken, Caleb," she whispered. "Not when you are here." She tilted her head, and their mouths met. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was the kiss of 2 people who had looked into the abyss and decided to turn back. It tasted of salt and dust and blood, but it was the most life-affirming thing either of them had ever felt. Lena's hands went to his shoulders, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. Caleb's arms went around her, ignoring the pain in his ribs, pulling her against him until there was no space left. They mapped each other with their hands, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw, his hands soothing the ache in her back. It was an anchoring, a claiming. The night deepened around them. They spread the saddle blanket on the sand. There were no words left to say, and no need for them. In the shelter of that rock, with the wind sighing high above the canyon walls, they let down the last of their defenses. Lena had spent years building walls to keep men out, to keep herself safe from their greed. Caleb had built walls to keep his own violence in, to protect the world from himself. But here, in the dark, the walls crumbled. They held each other with a fierce tenderness. Every touch was a question. "Are you here? Are you with me?" And every response was a promise. Yes, always, later, curled together under the thin wool of the horse blanket. Lena rested her head on Caleb's shoulder. She listened to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "I have been waiting so long," she whispered into the darkness. Caleb tightened his arm around her. "For what? For someone to stay," she said. For someone to see all the broken parts of me and not look away. For someone to want the woman, not just the body. Caleb pressed a kiss to the top of her head. He breathed in the scent of her hair, sweat and dust, and something sweet that belonged only to her. I am not going anywhere. Lena, he vowed, if the desert wants to take you, it is going to have to go through me first, and if Briggs thinks he can touch you again, he will have to kill me twice. They slept then, a fitful, exhausted sleep. But for the first time in years, neither of them was lonely. Morning brought clarity. The sun struck the top of the canyon wall, painting a line of brilliant orange light that slowly descended toward them. Caleb woke first. He lay still for a moment, feeling the warmth of Lena against him. The pain in his body was a dull roar, but his mind was sharp. They couldn't run. If they ran, they would be fugitives. Briggs had the law in his pocket. He would send marshals after them, brand them as thieves and murderers. They would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. Never safe, never free. Lena stirred and opened her eyes. She looked at him, and a slow smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had seen her smile without a shadow behind it. "Morning," she murmured. "Morning," he said. He sat up, groaning as his stiff muscles protested. "We have a choice, Lena," he said, his voice serious. "I know," she said, sitting up beside him. "We can run. We can—" He agreed. "We can take the horse and head for California. But they will hunt us. And Briggs, he will just keep doing what he does. He will find another singer to torment. He will cheat another trail boss. He will burn another shanty." Lena's face hardened. "I know. I memorized the route," Caleb said. "When I was looking at the map Briggs gave me, I memorized the location of the drop. But I also know something else, the canyon where he stores the contraband before it moves. It is not far from here. It is called Dead Man's Draw. You think the guns are there? Some of them, maybe, or the records. Briggs is arrogant, but he is a businessman. He keeps ledgers. If we can get proof, real proof, we can go to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe, not the local law, the federal law." "So we go back?" Lena asked. "Not to town, but to the fight?" Caleb looked at her. "Are you with me?" Lena reached for her boots. She pulled them on, wincing at the stiffness in her legs. She stood up and brushed the sand from her dress. She looked at the man who had saved her life, and whom she had saved in return. "I am done running. Caleb, let's go get him." They rode double on the bay horse, moving slowly to spare the animal. They headed north, cutting across the open desert toward the rugged country where Caleb suspected Briggs' operation was hidden. By mid-afternoon, they were parched again. The water from the seep was gone. Up ahead, near the base of a mesa, Caleb spotted a smudge of green, a cluster of cottonwoods. "There is a spring there," he said, "hidden spring. If we are lucky, there is water." As they approached, Caleb pulled the horse up short. He wasn't the only one who knew about the spring. A thin curl of smoke rose from the trees. Through the brush, he could see horses, not ranch horses, but mustangs, and men. It was a camp. There were 6 or 7 men, a mix of Mexican vaqueros and 2 Apache riders. They were sitting around a small fire, roasting a rabbit. Caleb recognized one of them, a vaquero named Mateo, who had ridden with him 2 years ago on a drive to Kansas. Mateo was a good man, but he had a long memory, and Caleb had been a hard boss. "They might not be friendly," Caleb warned Lena quietly. "We need water," Lena said, "and maybe we need more than that." She nudged him forward. Caleb rode into the clearing, his hands visible and empty. The men at the fire leaped up, hands flying to their weapons. "Easy," Caleb called out. "We are just passing through." Mateo stepped forward, his hand on his pistol. He squinted at Caleb. "Rourke?" he asked, surprised. "You look like you went 10 rounds with a bear. And lost." "Something like that," Caleb said, sliding off the horse and helping Lena down. The men stared at Lena. They knew who she was. The singer from the Golden Steer, the woman Briggs claimed as his property. "What are you doing out here, Rourke?" Mateo asked. his eyes darting to the Apache riders, who were watching with stone-faced suspicion. "We heard stories. They say you stole Briggs's herd. They say you are an outlaw. They say a lot of things," Caleb said, leaning against the horse for support. "It is a lie," Lena said, stepping forward. Her voice wavered, but she held her head high. The men looked at her, surprised by her boldness. "Briggs set him up," Lena continued, walking toward the fire. "He hired Caleb to move guns, not just cattle, illegal guns. When Caleb found out, Briggs had his men beat him and leave him for dead." "Guns?" one of the Apache men asked, speaking in broken Spanish. "Rifles," Caleb confirmed. "Winchester repeaters, heading south." The Apache exchanged a dark look with his companion. They knew what those rifles did. They had seen the holes they punched in their people. "And the fire?" Lena asked, looking at Mateo. "The fire in the shanty town 3 nights ago. Briggs said it was an accident. He blamed your people. Mateo, he blamed the families." Mateo spat on the ground. "I heard my cousin lost his home in that fire. It wasn't an accident," Lena said, her voice growing stronger. "It was a distraction. Briggs had his men started to keep the town busy while he moved against Caleb. He burned your families out just to cover his own crimes." The circle of men went quiet. The anger in the air was palpable, a physical heat that rivaled the sun. "You saw this?" Mateo asked Lena. "I saw where it started," Lena said. "I saw the kerosene, and I heard Briggs laughing about it. He called you disposable." Mateo looked at Caleb. "And you? You are going back?" "I'm going to get the proof," Caleb said. "I know where he keeps his ledgers. I'm going to take them to Santa Fe. I'm going to see him hang." "But you are one man," Mateo said. "One man and a woman. Briggs has 20 guns. Caleb straightened up, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "Then that is 20 against 2. Bad odds, but I have fought worse." Mateo looked at the other vaqueros. He looked at the Apache riders. He looked at Lena, standing there in her torn dress, dusty and defiant, fighting for a man everyone else had written off. He looked back at Caleb. "I am tired of Elias Briggs," Mateo said slowly. "I am tired of paying him for water that falls from the sky. I am tired of his men looking at my wife." He turned to the Apache rider. "What say you, Chato?" The Apache nodded once. "The rifles must not cross the border." Mateo turned back to Caleb and grinned, a flash of white teeth in a dark face. "We have water, Rourke, and we have beans. Sit, eat, then maybe we talk about how to even those odds." Lena let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at her with a mixture of awe and pride. They sat by the fire, the alliance forming not out of friendship, but out of a shared enemy and a shared desire for dignity. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the desert, the plan began to take shape. They were no longer just running. They were an army, a small, ragged army, but an army nonetheless. And they were going home. The wind that rolled down from the mesas was not merely moving air. It was a physical assault. It carried the desert in its teeth, a grinding wall of brown grit that blotted out the sun and turned the afternoon into a premature, suffocating twilight. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of violence, while the earth below seemed to dissolve into a shifting haze of sepia and gray. Perdido Wells did not look like a town as they approached it. It looked like a graveyard of ships lost at sea, the buildings looming up from the dust as ghostly, indistinct shapes. The windmill groaned in the gale, a metal screech that sounded like a dying animal, its blade spinning uselessly against the brake. Lena Hart pulled her shawl tight across her nose and mouth. Squinting against the stinging sand, she rode the tired bay horse, flanked by Caleb on a borrowed Mustang and Mateo, the vaquero who had chosen to stand with them, behind them, obscured by the storm, rode 2 Apache men, ghosts in their own right, watching the perimeter. They halted behind the skeletal remains of the livery stable, where the wind offered a momentary reprieve. Caleb swung down from his saddle, his movement stiff. The bruise on his ribs from the beating in the canyon was a deep, aching fire. but the adrenaline coursing through him kept the pain distant. He reached up and helped Lena down. Her hands were cold, despite the heat of the storm. He held them for a moment, looking into her eyes. The dust coated her lashes, but the steel he had seen in the canyon was still there, burning bright. "Are you ready?" Caleb asked, his voice low to cut under the wind. Lena nodded. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a mixture of terror and a strange, fatalistic calm. She knew exactly what this plan cost. If they failed, they died. If they succeeded, the quiet life they had whispered about in the canyon, the anonymity, the peace, was gone. They would be the people who took down Elias Briggs. They would be marked. "I'm ready," she said. "Just get the papers. I will keep him busy. Do not let him touch you," Caleb warned, his jaw tightening. "If he tries, I know how to handle Elias Briggs," Lena said, cutting him off. "I have had years of practice. Go!" Caleb squeezed her hands once, hard, then released her. He signaled to Mateo, and the two men melted into the swirling dust, heading toward the alley that ran behind the main thoroughfare. Lena took a breath, tasting the grit, and smoothed her torn, dirty dress. She needed to look broken. She needed to look like the woman Briggs thought he had created. She walked out of the shelter of the stable and into the teeth of the storm, heading for the glowing yellow square of the office window. The office of Elias Briggs smelled of expensive tobacco, stale whiskey, and the dry, dusty scent of old paper. It was a fortress of mahogany and leather, a place designed to make anyone standing on the other side of the desk feel small. Briggs was sitting behind that desk, a glass of brandy in his hand, watching the storm batter the window pane. He looked up when the door opened, letting in a gust of wind and sand. Lena stepped inside and pushed the door shut, leaning against it as if her legs could no longer hold her. She lowered her shawl, revealing her face. She was pale, her hair tangled, her eyes wide with feigned desperation. "Well," Briggs said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Look what the wind blew in. I thought you had run off to die in the desert. Lena, I tried," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. I got scared. Elias, I ran out of water. I didn't know where else to go." Briggs chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. He stood up and walked around the desk. He was limping slightly, his gout flaring, but he still moved with the heavy menace of a bull. "I told you," he said, "the desert ends, but I am always here." He stopped a few feet from her, inspecting her. He saw the torn dress, the sunburn on her nose. He saw a woman who had been beaten by the world, and it pleased him. "I came to beg you," Lena said, stepping forward, hands clasped. "Please, Elias, call off the men. Caleb, he didn't steal anything. He is hurt. He is out there dying. He is a thief," Briggs said dismissively, "and a liar." "He is not," Lena cried, injecting a note of hysteria into her voice. "Please, I will do anything. I will work double shifts at the saloon. I will clean the boarding house top to bottom. Just let him go. If you forgive him, I will make it right. I promise." Briggs stared at her. Suspicion warred with desire in his eyes. He had wanted to break her for years, to see the pride snap in her eyes, and here she was, begging. He turned to his clerk, a thin, nervous man named Abernathy, who was huddled in the corner. "Get out," Briggs barked. "But sir, the storm," Abernathy stammered. "I said get out," Briggs roared. "Go to the saloon." The clerk grabbed his hat and scurried out the door, casting a pitying glance at Lena before vanishing into the brown haze. Briggs turned back to Lena. He walked to the door and turned the lock. The click was loud in the sudden silence of the room. "You will make it right?" Briggs asked, his voice dropping to a husky murmur. "You want to pay his debt?" "Lena, I want him to live," Lena said, backing away slowly. Briggs followed her. He was circling her like a predator cornering a wounded rabbit. "You know what the price is," he said. "You have always known. You have been playing hard to get for a long time. Darling, but I knew you would come crawling back. Everyone does." Lena kept backing up, her eyes flicking to the side door that led to his private safe room. She needed him away from the desk. She needed him focused entirely on her. Outside, in the alley, Caleb and Mateo were working frantically. The window to the safe room was painted shut. Caleb jammed the blade of his knife under the sash, working it back and forth, sweat stinging his eyes. "Come on," he gritted out. Inside, the tension pulled tight as a bowstring. Briggs lunged, closing the distance. He slammed his hand against the wall beside Lena's head, boxing her in. The smell of him, brandy and bay rum and entitlement, washed over her, triggering a wave of nausea. He gripped her wrist, his fingers digging into the tender flesh, twisting it just enough to hurt. "You are all alone. Lena," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "No cowboy is coming to save you. You belong to me. You are just another asset on my ledger." He leaned in, his wet mouth aiming for hers. The memory of the first time he had cornered her, years ago, flashed in Lena's mind. The fear, the helplessness. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She had crossed the desert. She had looked death in the face and laughed. She waited until he was off balance, leaning his weight onto her. Then she moved. She brought her knee up, hard and fast, driving it into his groin with every ounce of strength she possessed. Briggs let out a strangled sound, a high-pitched wheeze of agony. He doubled over, clutching himself, his face turning a mottled red. "You bitch!" he gasped. Lena shoved him. He stumbled back, crashing into a small side table, sending a lamp shattering to the floor. She didn't wait. She bolted for the inner door to the safe room. "Caleb!" she screamed. The window sash gave way with a crack of splintering wood. Caleb tumbled into the room. Mateo right behind him. Briggs, still hunched over, saw them. His eyes went wide. "You!" Briggs snarled. He scrambled toward his desk. He had a Smith Wesson hidden in the top drawer. Caleb saw the move. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself across the room, tackling Briggs just as the older man got his hand on the drawer handle. They crashed into the heavy oak desk, sending papers and inkwells flying. The chair tipped over with a crash. Briggs was strong, fueled by pain and rage, and he fought dirty. He gouged at Caleb's eyes, kicking out with his heavy boots. Caleb took a fist to the jaw that made his head spin, but he slammed an elbow into Briggs's ribs. The drawer slid open. The pistol slid out, skittering across the floorboards. Lena dove for it. She scrambled on her hands and knees, her dress tearing. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the barrel. She rolled onto her back, gripping the gun with both hands. "Stop!" she screamed. She leveled the pistol at Briggs. Caleb and Briggs froze. They were a tangle of limbs on the floor, breathing hard. Briggs looked up at the muzzle of the gun, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. Lena stood up slowly, her hands shaking violently. The gun wavered, pointing straight at Briggs's chest. "Get up, Caleb," she said, her voice tight. Caleb rolled away, standing up and wiping blood from his lip. He moved to Lena's side, but he didn't take the gun. Briggs slowly raised his hands. "Lena," he said, his voice wheedling. "Now. Lena, you don't want to do this. Put it down. We can talk about the debt." "Talk about the debt?" Lena laughed, a sound that bordered on hysterical. "You stole my life. Elias, you stole my name. You treated me like cattle." She cocked the hammer. The sound was deafening in the small room. "I should kill you," she whispered. "I should put a bullet in your heart and leave you for the rats." She wanted to. God, she wanted to. Every insult, every grab, every cold night in the boarding house demanded it. The desert seemed to press against the windows, whispering that blood was the only currency that mattered. "Lena," Caleb said softly. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on Briggs. "If you kill him," Caleb said, his voice calm and steady, "the town will not know. They will just see a dead man and a woman with a gun. They will call you a murderer. They will never see him for what he is." Lena's finger tightened on the trigger. "He deserves it." "He does," Caleb agreed, "but you deserve better than to be his executioner. You deserve to be the one who ends him the right way." Lena trembled. The tears finally spilled over, hot and stinging. She looked at Briggs, pathetic and sweating on the floor. She realized that killing him would be easy, but exposing him, that would destroy him. She let out a shuddering breath. She stepped forward. Briggs flinched, thinking the shot was coming. Instead, Lena reversed the pistol in her hand. She swung the heavy wooden butt in a vicious arc. It connected with Briggs's temple with a sickening thud. Briggs's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped to the floor, unconscious. Lena stood over him, breathing hard, the gun hanging limp in her hand. "Good choice," Caleb said quietly. Mateo came out of the safe room. He was holding a stack of papers and a thick, leather-bound ledger. "I found it," Mateo said, grinning. "The rifles, the land deeds, it is all here." The dust storm was beginning to break. The wind had dropped, leaving the air thick and hazy, but the visibility was returning. The commotion in the office had drawn attention. People were gathering in the street, wrapping scarves around their faces, peering through the gloom. The door to the office banged open. Caleb and Mateo dragged the unconscious body of Elias Briggs out onto the boardwalk. They dumped him unceremoniously on the wood. Lena stepped out behind them, still holding the pistol, her head high. The crowd gasped. The marshal, a man named Dombrowski, who had spent 10 years looking the other way, pushed his way to the front. "What in God's name is this?" Dombrowski shouted, his hand resting on his gun. "Rourke, you're supposed to be dead or running." "I am neither," Caleb said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. He reached out and took the ledger from Mateo. He held it up high. "This is the truth," Caleb shouted. He opened the book. 200 Winchester rifles, Caleb read. Stolen from Army supply lines. Sold to insurrectionists south of the border. Signed by Elias Briggs. The crowd muttered. The Garcia land deed. Caleb continued. Flipping a page. Foreclosed on a false debt of $50. Value of the land, $500. He looked at the crowd, meeting their eyes. "He has been stealing from you. He has been stealing your land, your water, and your lives. He started the fire in the shanty town to cover his tracks while he tried to have me killed in the devil's spine." "Lies," a voice screeched. "Mrs. Gable." The churchwoman pushed forward, her face twisted in indignation. She pointed a shaking finger at Lena. "Do not listen to them. She is a liar and a whore. She seduced him, and now she has brought this outlaw back to rob him. She will say anything for a man." The insult landed like a slap. Lena flinched. She felt the weight of every whispered rumor, every judgmental stare she had endured for years. Caleb stepped down from the boardwalk. He moved until he was standing between Lena and the crowd. He looked Mrs. Gable in the eye. "She is the bravest person in this town." Caleb roared. "While you were crossing the street to avoid her, she was riding into the desert to save a life. While you were listening to Briggs's lies, she was finding the truth. I trust her with my life. And if any of you had half her courage, Briggs would have been in jail years ago." Silence stretched across the square. Then, a movement from the back. A young woman, a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, stepped forward. "My rent," she said, her voice shaking. "It went up every month. Briggs said it was maintenance fees. I never saw any maintenance." Another figure stepped out, a Mexican father, his face streaked with soot from the fire. "He told me if I didn't work the Sunday shift for free, my family would be evicted." The man said. He said the law belonged to him, and an aging cowboy, a man who had worked for the Circle T for 20 years, spat on the ground. "I saw the wagons," he grunted, "heavy crates under the feet. I thought it was whiskey, but rifles, that is a hanging offense. The dam broke." The fear that had held Perdido Wells in check for a decade shattered. Voices rose up, angry and demanding. The marshal looked around, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked at the ledger in Caleb's hand. He looked at the unconscious men on the boardwalk. He realized the tide had turned. "All right, now," the marshal said, holding up his hands. Let's see those papers." "Rourke." A groan came from the boardwalk. Elias Briggs was waking up. He rolled over, clutching his head. He blinked, seeing the crowd, seeing Caleb holding the ledger, seeing the marshal reaching for it. He realized in a split second that it was over. His empire of fear had collapsed, and if he couldn't rule it, he would burn it. "Kill them!" Briggs screamed, scrambling to his knees. He looked at his hired guns, 3 men standing near the saloon porch. "Open fire! Damn you! Shoot them!" The hired men hesitated, but Briggs' foreman, Royce, who had just ridden in from the livery, didn't. Royce drew his gun. "Down!" Caleb shouted. He tackled Lena, throwing them both behind the heavy wooden wheel of a supply wagon just as the first shot cracked through the air. Chaos erupted. The square dissolved into madness. People screamed and dove for cover. Dust kicked up by running feet blended with the gun smoke. Bang! Bang! A bullet splintered the wood of the wagon wheel right next to Lena's head. Caleb returned fire, peering over the rim of the wagon. He saw Royce taking aim. Caleb fired. Royce spun away, clutching his shoulder, but there were other guns now. Briggs had pulled a hideout pistol from his boot. He was firing wildly into the crowd, not caring who he hit. "Damn him!" Caleb hissed. He felt a sudden, sharp sting in his shoulder. He grunted. "Falling back! Caleb!" Lena cried. "It is nothing." He gasped. A graze. He looked through the spokes of the wheel. In the middle of the street, a small shape was lying in the dust. It was the little boy, the one Lena had pulled from the fire. He had been running toward his mother. He wasn't moving. "No," Lena whispered. Tragedy tore through her chest, sharp and cold. The innocence of the scene was shattered. The marshal saw the boy fall. He saw the blood on the dust. Something inside the corrupt lawman finally snapped. He looked at Briggs, who was reloading his pistol, his face twisted in a mask of hate. "Enough," the marshal shouted. He raised his rifle and fired. The bullet caught Briggs in the thigh. Briggs screamed. The impact spun him around. He staggered backward, his leg giving way. He fell against the railing of the boardwalk, then tumbled into the dirt. He tried to stand, but his leg was useless. He looked up. The crowd was no longer fleeing. They were turning, and they looked angry. Briggs scrambled backward, dragging his ruined leg. He looked toward the edge of town, where the dust storm was still swirling, a wall of brown oblivion. He didn't wait. He clawed his way into the dust, limping and crawling, disappearing into the grit like a creature of the storm returning to its element. "Let him go!" Caleb shouted as Mateo raised his gun. "The desert will take him!" The shooting stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sobbing of the boy's mother. Lena scrambled out from behind the wagon. She ran to the boy. She knelt in the dust, her dress soaking up the blood. He was alive, but barely. A bullet had taken him in the side. "Help me," Lena cried. "We need a doctor." Hands reached out. The townsfolk, the same ones who had shunned her, were there now. They lifted the boy gently. "Mrs." Gable was there, her face pale, pressing her apron against the wound. She looked at Lena. There was no judgment in her eyes now, only shared horror. Caleb stood up, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He walked over to where the ledger lay in the dirt. He picked it up. His hands were shaking. The marshal walked over to him. He looked at the direction Briggs had fled, then at the ledger. "I will take that. Rourke," the marshal said quietly. "I will wire the territorial judge in the morning." Caleb handed him the book. "It is over," Caleb said. The marshal nodded. "It is over." Caleb looked around the square. Windows were smashed. The water trough was toppled, water muddying the dust. People were crying. He limped over to Lena. She was standing up, her hands covered in the boy's blood. She looked at him, her eyes haunted. "We did it," she whispered. "But the cost." Caleb put his good arm around her. He pulled her close, letting her lean on him. "Justice always costs, Lena," he said softly. "But look." He nodded toward the crowd. They weren't looking at the ground anymore. They were looking at each other. They were helping the wounded. They were talking. The fear was gone. The town of Perdido Wells was scarred, battered, and bleeding. But for the first time in a long time, it was free. The silence that settled over Perdido Wells in the days following the shootout was not the peace of a Sabbath morning. It was the stunned, hollow quiet of a man who has taken a blow to the jaw and is still waiting for the world to stop spinning. The desert wind, always an opportunist, found new places to sing. It whistled through the shattered panes of the Golden Steer Saloon and moaned through the bullet holes that pockmarked the water trough. The smell of gun smoke had faded from the air, but it seemed to linger in the rough-hewn boards of the boardwalk, a sharp, metallic scent that mixed uneasily with the dust. Funerals were held under a sky so pale it looked washed out, the sun a distant white disk that offered heat but no comfort. There were no hymns sung, just the murmured prayers of a town trying to understand how its foundation had crumbled so quickly. The graves were dug in the hard, unforgiving earth at the edge of town, joining the rows of those the desert had claimed before. Elias Briggs was not among the dead, though many whispered it might have been a kindness if he were. He had been found 3 miles out of town, dragging his mangled leg through the scrub brush, delirious with pain and thirst. He had not been found by his loyal men, for they had scattered like cockroaches when the light was turned on. He had been found by a patrol of territorial officers, hard-faced men in dusty blue coats who had ridden down from Santa Fe. They had been alerted by a rider, a cousin of the vaquero Mateo, who had carried the ledger and Caleb's message through the night. The law, often slow and indifferent in the territories, had finally arrived with the weight of a sledgehammer. When they dragged Briggs back into town, strapped across a saddle like a sack of feed, his power was visibly broken. He was no longer the king of Perdido Wells. He was a whimpering, broken old man with a festering wound and a future that held only a jail cell and a rope. The officers did not stop with the arrest. Guided by the map Caleb had drawn from memory, they rode out to Dead Man's Draw. They returned 2 days later with 3 wagons heavily laden with crates. They pried them open in the town square, revealing the gleam of blue steel and polished wood. 200 Winchester repeating rifles. The proof was undeniable. The town marshal, Dombrowski, stood on the porch of his office, looking at the rifles and the ledger the officers had seized. He looked small, a man whose authority had been revealed as a sham. He could no longer pretend this was a private matter, a squabble over cattle or a woman. The federal government did not take kindly to arms smuggling. The marshal quietly resigned the next morning, handing his badge to the lieutenant and riding out on the noon stage. The reaction of the townsfolk was a fractured thing. The truth was out, stark and undeniable. But pride is a stubborn root. Some clung to their old prejudices like a shield. They gathered in the mercantile, muttering that Lena Hart and that drifter Rourke had brought nothing but trouble. They claimed the town had been peaceful before, ignoring the rot that had been eating it from the inside. She is still what she is, Mrs. Gable sniffed, adjusting her bonnet as she walked past the boarding house. A leopard does not change its spots just because it shot a tiger, but there were others. Quietly, almost secretly, the mood began to shift. A basket of fresh eggs appeared on the back step of the boarding house. A jar of peach preserves was left on the windowsill. The Mexican and native families, who had walked with eyes downcast for years, now walked down the center of the street. They tipped their hats to the territorial officers, and they looked at the Golden Steer not with fear, but with the grim satisfaction of survivors. In the back room of the boarding house, Caleb Rourke lay on a narrow cot, listening to the wind. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, heavy rhythm, a constant reminder of the bullet that had grazed the bone. He spent his days watching the patterns of sunlight crawl across the cracked plaster of the ceiling. He felt unmoored. For 5 years, he had been running, expecting a bullet in the back. Now, he was lying in clean sheets, and the men with badges were tipping their hats to him. It did not feel real. He half expected the door to burst open, for the officers to realize their mistake and drag him off in chains. He was a man who knew how to survive war, how to survive the desert, but he did not know how to survive peace. Lena was his anchor. She moved through the room with a gentle efficiency that belied the exhaustion bruising her eyes. She changed his bandages, her touch firm but agonizingly careful. She helped him sit up to drink broth. her arm supporting his good shoulder. There was a new quality to their silence. It was no longer the desperate, charged silence of the canyon. It was softer, domestic, and terrifyingly intimate. It was in the way her fingers brushed his when she handed him a cup of water. It was in the way his hand lingered at her waist for a second too long when she steadied him on his feet. It was in the way they avoided talking about the future, because the future was a fragile thing that might shatter if they looked at it too directly. One evening, 3 weeks after the shootout, a knock came at the door. It was Lieutenant Reynolds, the officer in charge of the territorial patrol. He was a decent man, with a mustache waxed to sharp points and eyes that had seen enough of the frontier to know the cost of survival. "Miss Hart," Reynolds said, removing his hat. "May I have a word?" Lena stepped into the hallway, leaving the door ajar. Caleb strained to listen. "We are heading back to Santa Fe in 2 days," the lieutenant said. "The judge will want your testimony regarding Briggs. But after that, well, the city is a big place. There are opportunities there. Jobs for a woman of your talents, not the saloon kind. Seamstress work, or teaching." Lena was silent. "I can offer you safe passage," Reynolds continued. "A wagon ride all the way to the railhead. It would be a fresh start. Miss Hart, a place where no one knows your name, a clean slate." Caleb heard the rustle of Lena's dress. He imagined her face, the conflict, the sudden flare of hope, a clean slate. It was what she had dreamed of when she left Missouri, a place where she wasn't the fallen woman, the widow, the outcast. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Lena said, her voice soft. "That is a generous offer." "Think on it," Reynolds said. "You have earned a ticket out of this dust bowl." When Lena came back into the room, she didn't look at Caleb. She went to the window and stared out at the darkening street. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet. Beyond the roofs of the town, the desert stretched out, endless and empty. Caleb watched her. He saw the way her hand gripped the curtain. He knew what she was thinking. He knew what she deserved. She deserved silk dresses. She deserved paved streets and gas lamps. She deserved a life where she didn't have to scrape the sand out of her teeth every morning. "The lieutenant made you an offer," Caleb said, his voice rough from disuse. Lena turned. "Yes, he offered me a ride to Santa Fe. You should take it," Caleb said. He forced a smile onto his face. It felt brittle, like dried clay. "It is what you need. Lena, real safety. Far away from here. Far away from the memories. You could open a shop. You could live like a lady." Lena looked at him, searching his face. "And you? Me?" Caleb let out a short, dry laugh. "I am a trail hand. Lena, I go where the work is. I will heal up, and then—" Well, the territory is big. Beneath his words, the fear was a cold knot in his gut. He wanted to beg her to stay. He wanted to tell her that the thought of waking up without her nearby felt like dying. But he looked at his hands, scarred, stained, dangerous hands. He was a man who attracted trouble. If she stayed with him, she would never be safe. She would always be looking over her shoulder. Hurt flickered across Lena's face, quick and sharp. She stepped away from the window. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "You want me to go?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and hot. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against Caleb's chest. "It is not about what I want," he said, his voice unsteady. "It is about what is best for you. I am not a safe bet. Lena, I am a man with a past that follows him. I will only drag you down." Lena walked toward the cot. She moved slowly, deliberately. She knelt beside him, the hard floorboards creaking under her dress. She reached out and took his hand, the scarred one, the one he thought was only good for breaking things. She held it in both of hers, pressing it against her cheek. "Look at me, Caleb," she commanded. He looked. He saw the gold flecks in her eyes. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw. "I have been waiting so long," she whispered. Caleb swallowed hard. "Waiting for what? To leave?" "No," she said fiercely. I have been waiting for someone to stay. I do not want a perfect man. Caleb, I do not want a man in a silk suit who will treat me like a doll. I want the man who crossed the desert for me. I want the man who stood in front of a mob and told them I was brave." She squeezed his hand, her fingers trembling. "I want the man who will cross the desert with me, rather than leaving me behind." Caleb's careful distance cracked. The wall he had built to protect her from himself crumbled into dust. He looked at this woman, this incredible, resilient woman who had seen the worst of him and still reached out. "Lena," he choked out. He reached up with his good arm and pulled her down. She came willingly, careful of his wound, settling onto the edge of the narrow cot. Caleb buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of her. "I am afraid," he admitted, his voice muffled against her skin. "I'm afraid love is not enough to keep the world away. Then we will fight the world," Lena whispered. "Together." He pulled back to look at her. Tears were spilling down her cheeks, but she was smiling. It was a radiant, terrified, beautiful smile. "I am not going to Santa Fe," she said. "I am staying right here." Caleb closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against hers. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay." They kissed. It was not like the kiss in the canyon, driven by the desperation of survival. This was slow. It was a steady, burning tenderness that started in their chests and spread outward until it warmed the cold corners of the room. It tasted of salt and relief. It tasted of a future neither of them had thought they were allowed to have. Every touch was a declaration. "I choose you." Not because there was no one else, but because there was no one else who mattered. Their bodies, weary and scarred, recognized a home that wasn't a place on a map, but a person. In the weeks that followed, the town of Perdido Wells watched with bated breath. They expected Lena Hart to take the lieutenant's offer. They expected Caleb Rourke to drift away like smoke. They did neither. When the territorial officers rode out, Lena stood on the porch of the boarding house and waved goodbye. Then she went to the bank. Using a share of Briggs' seized assets, money the court had granted to the victims of his schemes as restitution, Lena and Caleb bought a deed. It was not a grand ranch. It was a small, rugged patch of land 10 miles out of town, nestled against the red rocks near the Apache Spring. The scrub grass struggled there, and the wind blew hard, but the water ran clear and cold, just enough to sustain life. They moved out 2 weeks later. The work was brutal, but it was healing. Caleb, his shoulders stiff but mending, mixed adobe mud with straw. Lena hauled water and smoothed the plaster. They built a low, sturdy house with thick walls to keep out the heat. They built a fenced corral for horses. They called it simply the way station. They hung a sign by the trail: water, rest, no toll. It was a quiet revolution. In the harsh economy of the desert, water had always been a weapon. By giving it away, or charging only a fair coin for a hot meal, they broke the cycle Briggs had established. Travelers began to stop. At first, it was just the desperate, prospectors with empty canteens, drifters with nowhere else to go. Then, the Mexican families traveling between settlements. Then, the Apache riders who appeared like shadows at dusk to water their ponies. The station became a sanctuary. It was a place where a man's past didn't matter as much as his thirst. Prejudice did not vanish overnight. It was too deeply ingrained in the soil of the territory. When some of the townsfolk from Perdido Wells passed through on their way to the city, they muttered. They glared at Lena's bare head, her hair loose and windblown. They eyed the gun belt Caleb still wore, low on his hips. "Look at them. Misses," Gable would whisper to her husband as their wagon rattled past. "Living out here like savages. It is not right." But they stopped for water all the same. And when they did, Lena would ladle it out with a steady hand, meeting their eyes until they looked away in shame. Others were different. One afternoon, a dusty pony trotted into the yard. A small figure slid off. It was the boy. The one who had been shot in the square. He walked with a slight limp, but he was alive. "Mr. Rourke?" the boy asked shyly. "Miss Lena, Juan," Lena cried, dropping her basket of laundry and rushing to hug him. "My mama says—" Juan started, pulling a cloth-wrapped bundle from his saddlebag. She says you might need peppers and corn. He stayed for dinner. Then he stayed for the weekend. Soon, Juan was spending his summers at the way station, helping Caleb mend fences and learning how to track lizards in the rocks. A widowed woman from town, Mrs. Higgins, who had once been afraid to speak to Lena, moved into the spare room to help with the cooking. She brought her grandmother's recipes and a sharp tongue that kept the unruly travelers in line. The table at the way station grew longer. On any given evening, under the wide, indifferent sky, one might find a Mexican vaquero breaking bread with a white prospector, or an Apache scout sharing coffee with a former soldier. They ate beans and cornbread, shared news of the trail, and laughed. It was a fragile oasis. The desert was still dangerous. There were still storms and droughts and men with hard hearts. But inside the adobe walls, there was peace. One dawn, 6 months later, the desert was particularly beautiful. The sun had not yet crested the mesas, but the sky was alive with a gradient of colors that had no names, deep indigo fading to violet, bleeding into a soft, tender peach. Lena stood on the porch of the station, a mug of coffee in her hand. She watched the light spill over the rocks, illuminating the endless stretch of sand and sage. She heard the door open behind her. A moment later, warm arms wrapped around her waist. Caleb rested his chin on her shoulder. He smelled of sleep and wood smoke. He felt solid against her back, a weight that grounded her to the earth. He didn't say anything. He just held her, watching the sunrise with her. Lena leaned back into him, closing her eyes for a moment to feel the steady beat of his heart against her spine. She thought about the girl she had been, the frightened widow waking up under a burning sky, blaming herself for surviving. She thought about the woman who had sung in the saloon, hollowed out by loneliness. That desert, the desert of desire, of hunger, of waiting, was gone. "Penny for your thoughts," Caleb murmured, his voice rumbling in his chest. Lena opened her eyes. She looked out at the wild, harsh land that tried to kill them every day, and which they loved anyway. "I was just thinking," she whispered. "I'm still waiting." Caleb stiffened slightly. "For what?" "For new days," Lena said, covering his hands with hers. "For new storms, for new fights to win. The roof needs patching, and the corral fence is leaning, and winter is coming." She turned in his arms so she could look up at him. His face was lined by the sun, the scar on his jaw a white line against the tan. But his eyes were clear. "I am waiting for all of that," she said, "but I am no longer waiting for love." Caleb smiled. It was a slow, easy smile that reached his eyes. "No," he said, "you are not waiting for that." He pressed a kiss to the side of her neck, just below her ear. "Whatever the desert brings." "Lena," he said, "we face it, side by side." She finished, side by side. The sun crested the mesa, a blinding flare of gold that set the world on fire. It bathed the small adobe house, the corral, and the two figures on the porch in a brilliant, cleansing light. They stood there, framed against the vastness of the American West. The land was still harsh. It was still wild. It would never be tame. But finally, for Lena Hart and Caleb Rourke, it was something else entirely. It was home. Thank you, dear friends, for riding this long trail with me. It has been a pleasure to spin this tale of grit, gunpowder, and the enduring power of love in the American West. I would love to hear where you are listening from today. Are you watching the sunset in Arizona? Or listening to the rain in London? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Lena and Caleb's journey in English. And if you have a hunger for more stories from the frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West. There are many more tales hidden in the dust, waiting to be told. Until we meet again on the trail. Adios.